It's a pleasure to introduce The City, the newspaper, the capital city, not the camel case city. They came on as a media sponsor, and we're really, really appreciative of them sharing the call out to their readers, which I think there are a few readers in the room. Yeah, there's a few. All right. I think many of us who read The City on a daily basis are really excited that they're another nonprofit newsroom that showed up in town and has been telling really great stories and apparently hiring really talented people and hiring friends as well. So it's an honor to have them here, and it's an honor for them to more or less present to you about the work that they do and how they use open data to cover our town. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Scott, and he's going to run the rest of the show.
Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Klein. We're going to go just do some quick introductions. But before I do so, Noel got some applause, but just by show of hands, how many people have read a story on our website? That is awesome. That is really great. How many people have looked at a map or chart or a piece of data journalism that we've done? Fantastic. Oh, that's great. That's terrific. Donated money to the city? Yay! Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. So I shouldn't need to say this because everybody raised their hand, but the city is a relatively new newsroom. We've been around for about 3 years, but we are here. We are the newsroom for, by, and about everyday New Yorkers, and we sort of have a two-part mission. One is hard-hitting news that holds the powerful in New York City to account, and also explanatory journalism and data journalism that helps everyday New Yorkers make good decisions, lead safer lives, and so forth. So that's the city. Oops. There we go. I had this, does anybody know what Midjourney is? Midjourney is a generative AI image maker. And I asked it to make, sort of like ChatGPT, but for images. And I asked it to make a pigeon staring intently at a computer. And this is what it made. So it is now the official logo of the data team at the city. We love it. So the data team at the city, we are nerds with a journalism habit. So each of us comes to this with some journalism background, but actually some of us not with a journalism background, but mostly with quantitative backgrounds. So I come through technology. I, like many technologists, majored in British religious poetry in college. And I make use of that every day in my work, but I kind of mostly build software that tells journalistic stories. So quickly, do you want to go through just kind of so everybody knows everybody's name?
Yeah, hi everyone, my name is Suhail Bhat. I am one of the data reporters at the city. I'm a 2020 graduate of Columbia Journalism School and former correspondent with Reuters News and data reporter with Louisville Public Media in Kentucky.
Hi, my name is Sam Rabiyah. I am the news apps developer at the city. And I actually used to work at this place called Just Fix, which I know some of y'all might be familiar with. I started at the city last September. And so, yeah, I've kind of just been transitioning between those two worlds.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anjali Tsui, and I'm the project editor of the Missing Them project. That's our COVID memorial and journalism project at the city. And prior to joining the city, I'd worked at places like CNN, ProPublica, and Frontline PBS. I was also an English major and read a lot of poetry in college.
Anjali and I worked together. I was at ProPublica. I've only been at the city only a little bit longer than Sam. I think Sam was there like maybe a month before me. I just got there in October, and before that, I worked at ProPublica with Anjali. So I just want to kind of give a quick background about data journalism. It seems very new, and it seems like everybody who does it is very young, but in fact, it goes back to the very earliest days of what we might even plausibly call news. This is from the very first issue of The Guardian, which was then in Manchester, and is now kind of all over the UK. This is from 1821. It's a list of students in day schools, in public schools, what we would call public schools in Manchester. So data journalism goes all the way back. It even goes all the way back, or a long way back here in New York City. In the early 1970s, the New York Times not only published crime maps that sort of showed crime levels in different neighborhoods in New York City, but it actually also showed, it also published the raw data itself. So way back in 1973, people were doing data journalism, and though they didn't have interactive software then, they were building interactive graphics and exposing what might be considered raw data for people to consume and to understand their city. So data journalism isn't new. Probably the kind of modern version of data journalism comes out of work that a guy named Philip Meyer did almost exactly 50 years ago when he was a correspondent for the Detroit News. And after the Detroit riots, he did a survey, he did a study, a social science kind of valid study of rioters and non-rioters to try to get at what was going on with the riots in Detroit. And he published that as a story and as a white paper with Urban League and SRI, which is a social science research organization. So it goes way back. This field used to be called computer-assisted reporting, mostly called data journalism now. But again, it is the kind of melding of academic, what we might now call data science, but academic social science with journalism. And so the city does lots of data journalism. These are 3 recent examples. My colleagues are going to talk about lots more. But these are ways to kind of help the regular New Yorkers kind of understand their city. So these are projects about voting. Sam particularly is going to talk about a project that we did very recently about rentals and housing. And we do a project that kind of tracks recovery from the COVID epidemic here in New York. So these are projects that we do and have done that are kind of part of the long tradition now of data journalism here in New York. So we use a lot of open data. You can take a look at that later. There are lots of journalistic data tasks that I think map very neatly onto some of the things that I've heard here at the conference and that I know that everybody who works with data does, which is to say mostly cleaning and occasionally, when you're lucky, some data analysis. So my colleagues are going to talk about sort of 3 aspects of how we use open data at the city. We're going to talk about the ways in which we use open data and we augment open data. We're also going to talk about the times when open data is useful, but not sufficient. We have to kind of get data from other places. And then finally, we're going to talk about a project where open data wasn't available. No data was available, and we had to collect it ourselves. So that's the schedule for today. So I'm going to turn it over to Suhail for the first part.
Hi, everyone. So how we use open data in our newsroom, first I should say that every story actually starts with a search on open data website. So if we have a topic, the first thing we do is
Speak directly into it like this.
Okay. If we have a topic, the first thing we do is actually search open data website to see what's out there, get a sense of like what kind of data is collected and how we can use that in our story. And what I do, the first step I do, if a reporter asks me like I want to look into something, is I use open data website to actually create visualization. It's like a complete journalistic data journalism task from the beginning to the end, using this tool, which is just outstanding. Because if I was coding, it would take me like around 2 hours to actually build this whole thing, like to read the data, clean the data, and create visualization, and actually give it a headline and a subhead and data source and everything else. So this is how we gut check everything before actually diving deeper into a story. We don't waste our time like with a lot of research. It saves plenty of time to just actually look into it and look what open data is saying. Then if we find that the story we are going in the right direction, then we start investigating further. Some of the elements of this chart is like, if you look at like the data selection part, you can group data, you can actually, see a graphic, see the table, and more importantly, you can filter data as well. And because of this filtering function, you can actually look for people you need to talk to, your sources, locations for your reporting. And if you look at the Department of Buildings permits issued, like it has phone numbers as well. You can call all these people for your stories, or at least you can find location for your, photojournalists to actually go take pictures or check out these places. This is one of the major functions of a data journalist is how you can combine data set A to data set B, and how you can create a correlation between different data sets. For example, if I'm looking at, say, crime, can I combine it with census data and any other data set, poverty, economic data? And sometimes the merge between data set A and data set B is not linear, it's not possible. So what you do is you create crosswalks between different data sets. So crosswalk actually gives a sense of like, it combines different geographic units with each other. It connects blocks with census tracts with neighborhood level, with community board boundaries. So these kind of files known as crosswalks, they help you combine data with each other. Once you have the ability to do so, you can actually combine you can create actually bigger data sets based on like a couple of different truncated data sets. And shapefiles. A big part of data journalism is geographic analysis. Reporters I have seen beat reporters can analyze data in Google spreadsheet, but what they can't do is make maps. So this is kind of a superpower for any data journalist. Like they can make maps and do concentration distributions and other geo analysis. And it's only possible when you have the basic product you actually need for geospatial analysis. That is the shape files. That's the sense of like boundary where the location of any geographic unit. And that's possible through shapefiles. And with open data, the beauty of open data is like it allows you to download these shapefiles in GeoJSON or shapefile as KMZ or KML. That also means like you can use any kind of software or program to actually read these files and do your analysis. And also, if you look, these points are like every New York City building. And it has, I think, 237 columns. It has all the details of New York City buildings. That's just outstanding. You can combine this data set with any kind of data. Then you can analyze the data. You can find the height of the buildings, the number of units, the number of complaints, like whether it's in a flood zone, whether it's a publicly funded building. These are examples of some of the stories that are entirely based on open data data sets. So this is one of the, after the 2020 protests and COVID, we were trying to understand what it means for policing. What's going on with the police and with the NYPD after summer protests in 2020 and COVID. So we looked at like their response time has gone up. So these three charts came out of like literally one data set. It's just a different way, actually different ways to build correlations between variables. So one data set can give you literally 3 leads. These are other stories that we found in open data and were reported using open data. And this is one example where actually open data was used in combination with other data that we got from Department of Homeless Services and combined that with some open data sets to actually look at what's going on with, cities' homelessness burden. So the fair share analysis, the fair share law was supposed to be that every neighborhood will take equal burden of homelessness in New York City. So, but our analysis showed that that's not right. It's actually the poorer neighborhoods that actually take an uneven burden of these homeless shelters. Yeah, Sam.
All right, so I'm going to transition us into talking about when open data is not enough to tell a story. Obviously, open data can provide such a great foundation for inquiry when it comes to reporting, when it comes to kind of fact-checking things. But as I'm sure a lot of people in this room know, sometimes there are just big gaps in what open data actually covers, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. And as reporters, especially if we're trying to, get to the truth behind things that don't have a lot of visibility yet, we find ourselves in situations where what we're looking for doesn't exist on open data, and we have to kind of look for different sources of information. So I'm going to kind of tell you that story in the context of a case study that we have that specifically looked at rent-stabilized apartments in New York City and how that housing stock has been affected over the past couple of years by lack of registration and apartment vacancies and a bunch of other issues that are relevant to sort of the housing movement in New York City. So, yeah, so we published this story. There's been a bunch of stories in this series, but this particular story we published in December, and essentially kind of like the point of inquiry for this story is we were in communication with the state housing agency that manages rent regulation and rent-stabilized apartments, and they gave us these numbers kind of across the whole city, across the whole state actually, that showed that over the last several years, the number of rent-stabilized apartments that landlords are registering has been consistently going down. And the reason why that's some really important detail for folks is there is a major change to the rent laws in 2019 that essentially got rid of a lot of what people considered loopholes to rent stabilization. There are a lot of ways that landlords were incentivized to, create vacancies or kick people out of their apartments to raise the rents, and there were pathways that they could actually have a rent-stabilized apartment that had a fixed rent and end up with one where they could charge any rent, a market rate apartment. 2019 kind of changed the game entirely for that, and it should be now very rare to actually legally deregulate or destabilize a rent-stabilized apartment. So that's also just anyone who's living in a rent-stabilized apartment, just know that. Like, if you're living there now and it's rent-stabilized, like, even if you leave, it's still going to be rent-stabilized. Very few exceptions to that, so that's another thing that we were covering. But we had these numbers, and essentially, we really wanted to know, okay, on the building level, where are these rent-stabilized apartments disappearing from the system? And that's notoriously something that a lot of sort of civic data folks have kind of hit a brick wall when they try to get. I used to work at this place called JustFix that worked a lot with city housing data, and there were several FOIL requests that people in our community filed, and there was always, they would always say there's some security concern with releasing the data on the building level. However, what's interesting is that there is this line on landlords' property tax bills that lists how many rent-stabilized apartments were registered during that tax period and then charge. And the reason that they have that is because you're supposed to charge a nominal fee. You have to pay like a nominal fee per rent-stabilized apartment you have. And I said many, many years ago, there was a project that actually scraped all of these property tax bills, which are public information online, and sort of extracted this number that you see here. And that was a way to actually get a glimpse at, like, on this particular building in a particular address, how many rent-stabilized units were registered that year. So this is called the Tax Bills Project. This was, I think, started 7 or 8 years ago. During my time at JustFix, JustFix sort of took over the maintenance of that project, and every year would sort of scrape new numbers. And now that I've transitioned to being a reporter, a journalist, I think it's really interesting to think of the ways that we engage with this data really differently from like a civic tech organization like JustFix. So what I was trying to do as a reporter in December is actually pinpoint buildings where there is a really suspicious drop in this number. And that led us to a building in Crown Heights, on the Crown Heights-Prospect Heights border, which essentially after 2019, just started registering less and less rent-stabilized units. There's no clear explanation why. I actually went to that building and met a bunch of the tenants who are living there. I chatted with them for a while, and a couple of them requested their official rent history documents from the government, which lists what the legal rent has been every year, like basically for the past like 4 decades. And we found some very suspicious and potentially alarming stuff, and I encourage you can read the article. You'll learn a little bit more about it. But it's interesting, like I think when you're just working with the data, it sometimes stops at the data, but in the reporting context, the data can be a jumping off point to actually, build deeper relationships with sources, in this case with tenants, and, do more of that direct outreach to get to the bottom of, a story. And so after that initial story, we ended up working with JustFix to publish this interactive map of all of the buildings that we have this data for. And this is a kind of another wing of our journalism practice where we'll create these sort of digital tools that actually build access to this information in its raw form, not necessarily just to tell a specific story. And so we launched this map last month, which basically shows every building where after 2019 there's been a drop in rent-stabilized units registered on the property tax bills. And people can search, and then it also links folks, if they click on a building, it links them to this article that we classify. There's this thing called service journalism, which I don't think really anyone outside of the journalism world I had absolutely no idea what that meant until I got this job. It basically is journalism in the form of kind of helping people navigate something or like offering it as a service. So for example, we published an article that actually guided people in requesting their official rent history documents from the state in order to kind of see their own specific history of their apartment and like how much money the previous tenant was being charged. And so that kind of went hand in hand with this interactive map that we made. And then I would say just the other thing that feels really different from this approach to the work versus working in like a civic tech org is we talk a lot with these press offices. So, we also talk with open data coordinators, which I know is like, really great, and it's awesome to have that resource. I think sometimes open data coordinators can be very, like their expertise is very much focused on the data and the data pipeline itself. Sometimes we also need to rely on contacting these press offices, and we'll, maybe email them multiple times a day with several questions, and we'll be on deadline, and it's a specific kind of relationship that we navigate. And through talking with the Department of Finance, we were able to get them to confirm exactly where these rent-stabilized unit counts were coming from, and they revealed to us that they actually get them directly from the state housing agency. They don't do anything on their own when they're putting the property tax bills together to generate this data. And then we followed up with the state housing agency, the Department of Homes and Community Renewal, and they confirmed for us that the records that they have come from like the actual registrations that landlords self-report, and gave us a bunch of detail also around how they actually can accept, if a landlord doesn't register an apartment, they can accept registrations as late as many years into the future, and the penalties are pretty minimal as long as they don't see anything illegal happening kind of in between that lapse of registration. So all is to say, building relationships also with these press offices and these press teams is something that I feel like is very specific to the journalism world and is sort of another pathway that we use to get to the truth on things. And then, after we published the map, we also made a lot of call-outs to our readers and our community for them to kind of send us tips or send us like any special information or facts that they have around their own housing experiences. And we got a lot of different messages from folks that either were discussing, what was going on in their building. They saw their building on this map and they wanted to clarify something or add some context, or, basically had a whole other story involved that they wanted to talk to us about. And so that still remains a really important part of our work is, making sure that we do have relationships and respond to requests from people who read our stuff. And yeah, I will leave it at that and pass it to Anjali.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our Missing Them project, which started in the spring of 2020 as the city was shutting down. I think those of us who were in New York City at that time can just recall the level of chaos and confusion and also the eerie quiet in certain parts of the city as businesses shut down and emptied out. So I would tune into Governor Cuomo's press conferences most days and hear these statistics about how many people were dying in our city across the state. But we wouldn't really hear about who these people were, who was really being affected. And the data showed that later on, COVID was especially hitting immigrants, people of color, especially Black and brown people in lower income parts of the city, especially hard, essential workers who couldn't afford to social distance. Yet we did an analysis, and it seemed like the more traditional obituary pages weren't really reflective of this. We tallied up obits that existed in the New York Times, the Daily News, and also websites like legacy.com. And early on in the pandemic, most of the stories that we came across skewed male or younger and people from wealthier parts of the city like Manhattan. So there seemed to be this disconnect there. We also tried to look for open data, but we ran into a barrier aside from the daily statistics that the Department of Health was providing in terms of the number of people who were dying, their genders, borough, and race. There wasn't any sort of more granular data like we saw in Suhail's example, where you could actually drill down to names. And the reason for that is that New York City and New York State has really restrictive laws around death certificates and making them public. So whereas elsewhere in the country, you might be able to get a hold of that information easily. Here in New York City, you have to wait till 75 years after someone passes away. That's when their death records become sort of open to the public. And genealogists know a lot about this. So we started crowdsourcing. And for those of you who are not familiar, crowdsourcing is just this term that we've come up with that refers to turning directly to the community to ask for stories. So what we did is our team set up a Google form asking people, have you lost someone to COVID, or do you work with victims' families? Help us remember New Yorkers who died of COVID. And there are very few required questions, like folks just had to tell us, who they were, and name the person they had lost, and they would then be connected with a journalist or volunteer who would then interview them to learn more about that person. But there were also a lot of other fields that we encourage people to fill out, down to sort of the zip code that they lived, which hospital they passed away, whether the person had any sort of underlying conditions. And we also gathered stories through text messages, and we had a phone number where people could call and leave us voice messages. And in order to make sure that people saw us beyond the city's readers, we printed out flyers, we joined Facebook groups, and we even contact every funeral home in New York City. So this is sort of a tactic that we use in every crowdsourcing project at the city to make sure we reach the right audience. We really have to bring that information to them. And in June of 2020, we launched our Living Crowdsource Memorial. So this is what it looks like, the Missing Them project. And to date, we've since published 500 obituaries and have recorded another 2,100 names. So this is still a small fraction of the totality of the loss, but we've been really proud of the fact that through crowdsourcing, we've been able to reach a more representative sample of New York City. And so the stories that you see here really span the 5 boroughs, people from all walks of life, and it's been this really amazing project to be a part of and to create this space. I just wanted to share one of the stories from our memorial. Rodolfo Acevedo, He came to the US by way of Panama and Nicaragua and moved to Corona, Queens. He graduated from the local public school, joined the Army, and then worked as a custodian for the USPS branch near him. And all of the obituaries are, what you might call like a data point, right? But it's so much more than that. We have all these wonderful stories and memories from each family member that we've gathered. And it's not just listing out the person's resume. There's a lot of heart to each piece. So here, his family told us how much he liked listening to vinyl records and working on model airplanes from his time as a paratrooper. He taught his kids how to tie their shoes, and these are really the memories that kind of stay on. We've been part of a lot of really amazing collaborations, and at the first anniversary of the shutdown, some photographs from the project were actually beamed onto the Brooklyn Bridge, and you see that too here. And through the project, we've gotten so many tips that have led to both accountability-driven journalism, looking at how the pandemic was handled in the city's jails, nursing homes, as well as what Sam was explaining, service journalism. So we've written guides on how to cope with grief, particularly how to help kids who are coping with grief, and so forth. And recently we published a series on long COVID that a lot of people right now are dealing with. This fall, through a grant from the Brown Institute for Media Innovation, we ventured out into the communities in Queens and Elmhurst, in Harlem, and also in Starrett City in Brooklyn. And we had all the series of listening posts where we heard directly from the community, and they had a chance to tell us sort of what they're dealing with now, 3 years out, and looking at the long tail of COVID. So that was really illuminating. And I want to highlight a series that we have done recently. So we were interested in understanding the kids who have been left behind. So there are actually across the US more than 200,000 children under the age of 18 who have lost a parent or caregiver to COVID. But at the time when we started this reporting, there was no data particular to New York City, and we wanted to understand the implications here. So we contacted the researchers at the University of Pennsylvania who were doing this work, and they did a special analysis for us using Census Bureau data and data from the NIH. And here's what we found, that 1 in every 200 kids in New York City has actually lost a parent or caregiver to COVID. That's roughly 8,700 children across the city. And if you were to put the kids in one room, that would actually fill up 15 average size public schools. So this, we really felt like, was a hidden problem. Like, no one was really talking about it. There were no sort of government services directed at these children who were still grieving and dealing with this loss. And so we also wanted to reach out to this community and launched a Google form call out. And our reporting did have a little bit of an impact. There was a city council bill that was proposed urging ACS to keep track of the data relating to these kids. And we've continued to do more journalism, particularly looking at how public schools have been responding to their needs. And sort of no surprises there. We found that, social workers and mental health clinicians were really overburdened in these settings, and kids weren't really getting the support that they needed. We partnered with Sam to document and visualize the stories of the kids themselves. So this was a really wonderful feature. We talked to all the kids up here on screen and asked them questions about their parent who they had lost and how it's been, what they wish their friends knew. And so, yeah, now we're really hitting the 3-year marker since the project's been around. And from now till the end of May, we're partnering with Photoville to bring the stories and obits from the project to public locations in the city. So if you have some time, I'd urge you to go out there. This one just went up yesterday, and it's at Moore Homestead Park in Elmhurst, and there's another one outside of the Bronx Documentary Center in the South Bronx. Yeah, thank you.
There's one more. Yeah, so I mean, that's what we kind of, we went short because we wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. But just sort of to recap, you know, I know speaking for myself, I came to the city, all caps, because I thought that the amount of open data and the amount of just sort of even not open data in New York City was truly remarkable. And there have not been enough journalists who have been, you know, using it to do great stories and to build interactive databases and kind of all of the work that we do now at the city. And so, and frankly, not enough coming here. And so, you know, our presence, not just as media sponsors, but as panelists here, I think is a down payment on the city's kind of hopefully further participation in this conference. And I just wanted to sort of end by saying, thanks for all of the work that you all do. I came for the first time to this conference last year, which may or may not have been the first one since COVID, but I'm not sure. I think they were virtual before then. But I just wanted to thank the work that you all do, and especially to thank the folks at BetaNYC and to Noel for putting this on and for having us. But yeah, we are eager to answer questions, eager to get tips if people have ideas for data stories or data sets that no one in a position like ours has yet unlocked to do great stories. We would love to hear it.
I was wondering, is there a style guide for data journalism or kind of standards for someone that isn't in a newsroom? How do you decide what to publish?
Yeah, I mean, there are a bunch. And also data journalism is a very, very big boat. So there's interactive data journalism, there's investigative data journalism, service journalism, as Sam said, which is sometimes what we call news you can use. And so kind of each of them have some of their own standards. There is a terrific book actually by Philip Meyer, the guy I talked at the beginning, called Precision Journalism, which is probably the academic guide to kind of how a lot of data journalism works. There's a book by Sarah Cohen, who now works at the University of Arizona, called Numbers in the Newsroom that a lot of us use. And also the AP now has, the Associated Press now has a data journalism style guide, and so there are a bunch.
Hey, thanks. Quick comment about the data sets that I guess you're curious about. I don't see them in the room, but there was a gentleman upstairs who aggregated the hospital data sets from the 2019 law. I don't know if you heard of him here, but that sounds like a perfect story for mapping the hospital quality care within New York City. And he has it for the data sets for the whole country. So it might be useful to speak to him.
I didn't see that. That was a panel upstairs?
Yeah, I just came from that session from the One Fact Foundation. So yeah, just a quick plug for them because I didn't see them in the room.
Is the person who gave that panel here? Maybe. Oh, Sue Jean's got it. By the way, this is Sue Jean, who's also on our team. So.
I have a bit of a question. So I'm really glad of this whole service journalism, but just going back to sustainability, I mean, beyond me subscribing to local newspapers, what can we do as citizens to make sure that you continue this great work, humanizing the data?
I mean, it's there's a guy named Clay Shirky who teaches at NYU's I2P who said something that I kind of think about a lot. Nothing may work, but everything might. And so, before this, I was at ProPublica, which is a very well-funded nonprofit journalism outlet. Now I'm at the City, which is a sort of much smaller journalism outlet, but still, sort of healthy, and we're not going anywhere. And so I think that philanthropic funding, I think, is a promising future for journalism. I think that, frankly, the move from relying on advertising to relying on subscribers has aligned newspapers, especially, aligned their interests with their readers' interests in a really good way. And so, I mean, the short answer, there's a long answer, and there are whole conferences just dedicated to this question. But the short answer is, keep subscribing and, help us. Every dollar matters, and kind of every donation and subscription helps, and really is sustaining. I mean, places like the New York Times were in really bad shape until they started, that paywall, which now I think largely pays for the place. So the answer is subscribe and donate.
Does your team also look at sort of the data you have within your organization of, what articles are people most interested in, and, where are people reading from? How do you use the data you collect to better understand your readers?
So we have a person who is not here today, but we have a person, in fact, a whole team. There's a woman named Zainab Shah, who is our head of audience. And she not only produces reports, but is very thoughtful about what people read, where they read from, what are the things that seem to induce them to subscribe and donate, and kind of thinking very deeply about how to get people from reading us occasionally to reading us all the time to subscribing to our newsletter to becoming donors and attendees at our events. So there is, it's one of kind of many kind of emerging fields within journalism that didn't exist 15 years ago, including what literally each of us do. But that is sort of audience development, growth management, sort of thinking through in a way that hopefully isn't creepy, sort of kind of understanding what people read and kind of how we can optimize that.
Hi, I wanted to ask about the hyper-local New York City media. Do you know anything about how they work with data? Do you collaborate with them in any way?
That's a great question. Yes, the answer is we do collaborate. So we are part of both formal and informal circles of news organizations, both in New York City and especially kind of around the country. So we've got good working relationships with WBEZ in Chicago and LAist in LA. And so it has the sort of ethos of the open source software community kind of came into newsrooms, I think, with people like the folks on stage, where rather than kind of being the newspaper war mentality where kind of, your greatest competitor in the world is the guy across town, we feel very much that, especially in the work we do, it's important for us to share our code, to share our data. And so to answer the question, yes, we are part of, and we would like to work with you as well, Anastasia. But specifically, we love to work with other newsrooms. We did a project. Go ahead, yeah.
Just to add to that, all of our articles are open to anyone who wants to republish them. So we recently did a project looking at how folks who live in the Bronx and Latinos across the city were reporting instances of long COVID at higher rates than other groups, and that speaks to the disproportionate impact on some communities. And there's, a hyper-local newsroom in the Bronx called Welcome to the Bronx, and they reposted our article. We translated the piece into Spanish, and so the Spanish language press also republished. The story I mentioned about the kids who lost their parents to COVID, that was a multi-part collaboration with City Limits, another sort of nonprofit news outlet in town, as well as Columbia Journalism Investigations and Type Investigations. So we're very much in this sort of collaboration mindset, but there's always kind of room to do more.
Hi. I love the work you guys do, and especially I love the COVID projects. I feel like it takes this number, like 44,000, just feels like very abstract and like impersonal, and like breaks it down to stories. I'm wondering like how much of that do you guys see as like part of what you do is not just it's like humanizing numbers, but also like helping New Yorkers in the city that's like has 9 million people like be more connected to each other by kind of seeing past things like numbers and neighborhoods and seeing into kind of those little stories as well.
Yeah, I think that's been, first, thank you. That's been a big mission and goal of the Missing Them project that's been going for 3 years. And it's been interesting to see how, like, as time has gone on, some people don't want to talk about the pandemic anymore, but among certain circles, there is really still this gaping need to remember and heal. And it's true, I think, when we think about data, this number of like 45,000, it's so hard for us to wrap our heads around. So I do think sort of a big mission of the project has been to sort of humanize this data and make it accessible, and then drill down on stories, because I think narrative is this really sort of powerful thing that people connect to. So there's a difference between even hearing like what I said earlier of like there are 8,700 kids across New York City who have lost a parent versus, Maddie Fletcher's favorite memory with her dad was when they went to the Girl Scouts daddy and daughter paint night in February of 2020. And so we try to do both and kind of connect the two.
Yeah, and just to amplify what Anjali said, I worked for my entire career in kind of national newsrooms, and this is my first time in a local newsroom. And not only do we see it as sort of part of our kind of mission to connect New Yorkers to each other, but we ourselves are New Yorkers. So, the difference in doing journalism sort of for a community that's 1,000 miles away and a community I can take the subway to is very different. I think Sam actually, do you want to talk about sort of, one of the things that we do is we call it door knocking, which is actually a word I hadn't known before I came to the city, where when you're doing a story, you literally kind of go to where the thing happened and you talk to people and sort of see if you can get the story that way. Sam, if you do want to talk a bit about kind of your experience kind of doing that for the, first few times for your Destabilized project?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think we showed a couple of like artifacts from that door knocking experience during the presentation. But to the question that was posed, like I think that really points to the ways that, like, as reporters, we can kind of take the data as a baseline and try and fill in the gaps that are just inherent at looking at numbers and looking at statistics. And so, so as I said, like for the rent stabilization piece, we had this data that was already coming from a non-traditional source, right? Because it wasn't something we could get through open data. And through actually kind of visiting buildings where we're seeing some data anomaly, that was our opportunity to actually like add more value to the data that we're getting to kind of check on it, but also see like, okay, when we see some kind of spike in the data like this, what does that actually mean when it's representing people's lives and where people live? And so, I think that that's why it's so valuable to combine all of these different methods together, because if we just had the data, there would still be so much ambiguity and so much like room for error when it comes to actually seeing how the data represents people. But if we're actually able to talk to people and build relationships with people, that's really where we get to the truth of things.
Actually, I just have a follow-up. You mentioned you can republish the articles, and you share code with other newsrooms. Do you also share data, the FOIL requests, and all that other stuff? Or maybe you should consider publishing them too. Yeah.
We do. I mean, we have a GitHub. We're on GitHub. We tend to release. I've only been there 5 months, so I don't want to characterize, what came before. But I mean, Suhail, do you want to talk a bit about I think we give everything away, but we should. Suhail, yeah.
That's true. Like we try to make as much as possible, make it public. and it is fundamentally our goal as well, like not only like write stories, actually contribute to the overall data pipeline in the city. Yeah.
Yeah, our stories are all free to republish under a Creative Commons license. Our data, I think if there's stuff that we're not sharing, there's a reason. It's only suitable for this one thing, or it's dirty, or we haven't written documentation and haven't had time. But the goal is to share everything, and not only that, but to share the, if there's a Jupyter notebook, if people know what that is, if that's the way that we've analyzed some data, we make that available as well. You first, and then.
Hello. First, thank you so much for the work you do. It sounds like you're shining a light on a lot of really critical issues. And relating to that, I was wondering what the relationship looks like with policymakers as it relates to, a response from the work you do.
So the beauty of data journalism to me is like you actually develop a lot of evidence on your own, right? It's a lot of conclusion-based work, partly academic exercise as well. So with data journalism, you already have like so much evidence. So you go with that evidence, you come up with a list of questions, and you just go to your council member or your mayor or anyone, and you ask them like, what's going on, how explain this, or any disparities or anything. That's like, you want like data journalism to stand on its own, but that doesn't happen all the time, but you try to build as much evidence as possible on your own. And by talking to people, like talking to like a politician should be your last thing.
I guess more so as like a response to the work you do you feel like, just with the COVID example, you said that there was a policy as a result of that work. So just curious if that's part of, scope ever, or, next steps as a result.
Yeah, I think our relationship with policymakers, maybe in the reporting process, we might talk to policymakers who have done work in this area to sort of understand that background. We might talk to sort of like policy staff to get a deeper understanding. And then we go and sort of do our reporting, combine that with the data, and we publish the thing. And oftentimes we are striving for impact, and one kind of impact would be sort of legislative impact. So we saw that in the example of the kind of COVID grieving kids that sort of caught the eye of a city council member who then worked with his team to devise this bill. But we didn't really have a part in that process. I think that's where we sort of draw the line of like, we're here to kind of provide the information, shine the light on the issue, and the policymaker's job is to kind of go ahead and design the policies. But we certainly report on policy and sort of think a lot about that. And there's so many people in our newsroom who are sort of like so well versed in that area.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's sort of a separation of concern. Sort of journalism sees as its objective to shine a light, to represent, to let everybody know about a problem, to explore it fully, to be fair-minded in how we characterize it, but not to come up with solutions, or at least not sort of policy solutions or political solutions, but to be kind of honest brokers, to make those decisions easier, to push reluctant policymakers to make decisions when necessary, but not toward a particular goal, or we are not advocates for a particular solution. We very much see kind of going back a long time, sort of see ourselves as kind of outside that process.
Over the course of the reporting, we might talk to so many sort of stakeholders within an issue in an area, and we might get a sense of what those solutions might be. But we're not in the business of actually sort of making those solutions and carrying them forward.
I'm just going to mention one example. Like, we were working on this report, and we published our story, and we got an email from comptroller office that they were looking into the same thing and doing the same analysis. So that happens quite a bit, actually. So once you publish a story, there are actually agencies doing the same kind of work. It's sometimes they beat you, sometimes you beat them. So.
Hi, thanks again for the work that you do. I wanted to ask specifically about the testing hypotheses part of the data journalism process. And I think that confirmation bias can be a problem in any kind of journalism, but I wonder if in data work specifically, there's a different layer to that. If it's maybe easier because the data is objective in the sense, or if it's harder because then you're leading the data towards the hypothesis you want. So I guess how you deal with that tension, as well as maybe are there examples of surprises where the data led you to something your hypothesis didn't support?
I mean, as much as possible, you try to go into a topic like with an open mind, right? You just, to me, like everyone has their own process. To me, it's like a learning exercise. It's like, how much can I learn about this topic without any biases or anything else? Otherwise, if you get like a tunnel vision, or if you have information bias, for example, if you have a reporter coming up with, I did reporting on something and I know this about this thing, and you are trying to just confirm that, I just try to look at the whole thing and do a lot of like sample testing, pattern analysis, then factuals and running counterfactuals. There are like a million ways. Once you reach to a particular finding, right, then your entire goal is to prove that this finding is wrong. So once you can eliminate everything that nothing is, once you can't prove that it's wrong, that means, you run both factual and counterfactual. So it's a lot of like, finding something is like, if it takes 2 hours, then doing the whole investigation takes another 2 days just to prove that you're right, yeah.
Yeah, and sort of one way in which data journalism is different from sort of maybe more academic data science, and this to me is the fun part, is we're kind of always validating our models in the sense that the most important part of the job is calling people. Right, calling people who we think are smarter than us, especially if we think they would disagree with us, calling experts, calling policymakers, calling people, regular old people doing door knocking, and sort of understanding, kind of looking in the real world to see if it matches what we're finding in the data. So, I mean, the answer to your question, do we ever kind of disprove our hypothesis in a surprising way? And it literally is like every day. We do it all the time. Suhail and I were working on something in which we thought we had a kind of a really terrific insight into a court system. And we called an expert and said, do you notice this too? Did we do this analysis correctly? And she said, no, you've done it completely incorrectly, and you've completely misunderstood the data, or you need to use this data set because that data set isn't appropriate for the query that you're trying to do. And that's great if you discover it before you publish. Much less great if you discover it after you publish.
Yeah, and after a year, and we take stock of like how many projects that we worked on and how many were actually published. Most of the time, it's like twice the number we didn't actually publish. That's for the reasons that we can't prove something, or we can't go ahead with, or we don't believe the data is true in itself, the underlying data. That's a big part of data journalism. It's like the credibility check of data in itself, whether the primary data, for example, by any agency is right. Like, can you prove that it's wrong? So that's the first thing we do, like just look at whether data is, right, yeah.
I just wanted also to ask, have you come across situations when the quality of open data itself is something to report on? So, for example, that it's not measuring something that it's supposed to measure, or when there are alternative measures that are different?
Yes. So if you look at like the homeless shelter system, it's like it's fabricated into 5 different agencies, right? There is DYC, DDHC, then there's some other agency as well, like the shelters for women and for runaway boys. So each agency publishes their own data set. So when you try to actually look at homelessness data, it's always an undercount because you don't know that there are other 3 agencies also publishing this data. So David Brand at City Limits fixed that problem. So that's a problem with the reporting in itself, actually. They should, the right way to do it would have been to actually accumulate the whole data and put it at one place, right? And then there are also like the missed trash story, right? Like when I first did the analysis, I saw a serious drop in March 2020, April 2020. At the time, I initially thought it's because people left the city, but the drop was it was really steep. So I called DSNY, asked them like whether this data is right. They're like, we haven't updated in 3 months. So, every time there is something odd, you just try to confirm it with someone else, like do the secondary check, yeah.
And just one other example, and I think we've almost run out of time, but before the city, I did a big project on hate crimes, nationwide project on hate crimes, and because that data is collected, there's a requirement that it is collected, but the requirement doesn't apply to local police forces, so the actual data collection in hate crimes is not great. And so it is very difficult to do kind of national reporting. 1 minute left. National reporting on hate crimes or even policymaking, I would assume, on hate crimes because the data is so imperfectly collected. But yes, all the time. Well, I think that about does it. Thanks very much, everybody, and thanks especially to BetaNYC for having us.
Thanks for being here.